welcome. I'm Kim. I'm the Intelligence Director at Transformers Foundation, and I'm going to be moderating this session today, which I'm really excited about. Before we get started, Transformers Foundation, for those of you who don't know, is the unified voice of the denim supply chain, and our founders include companies, people who are doing everything from cotton growing through to jeans factories, machinery companies, mills, the whole gamut of the denim supply chain. And we are a relatively new organization. We were founded in 2020. And every year we put out a deep dive report on a topic that matters to our community. So in 2020, we put out a report called Ending Unethical Brand and Retailer Behavior, which was all about purchasing practices and the order cancellations in the wake of the pandemic. Last year, we put out a report all about cotton and the misinformation surrounding cotton. And this year, our report is about chemical certification schemes, and it just launched a few days ago on Tuesday. And that report was written by Alden Wicker, who's here with us today, and I'm going to introduce her fully in a minute. But before I get to the panelists, I just want to say a few words about why we chose this topic this year. And I think the sort of macro level reason for this topic was that, it's impossible for us to collectively achieve any of our sustainability goals, from decarbonization to circularity to worker health and safety to consumer well-being to biodiversity and beyond if we don't get a better system in place for chemical management. And then the sort of more micro level reason for this was that it's something that was really affecting our community, both the denim supply chain writ large and our founders, as you'll probably hear throughout this conversation, because we have Zaki, Saleemi, and we have Alberto de Conti, who I will also introduce fully in a minute, but who are two of the Transformers founders on this conversation. So the report documents the lack of alignment on that rules around the lack of alignment that we have around chemical management rules and the impact that has on the denim supply chain and beyond. And our big call to action for this paper is collaboration. And, the paper says very overtly that we have to come together to figure out a single set of standards, and that strong chemical management systems should be a ticket to play and not a market differentiator. So that brings me to today, because this panel discussion, this roundtable discussion today is all about that collaboration. How do we do it better? And I'm really excited because how often do you get a mill, a chemical company, a representative of multiple chemical companies, a journalist and an author, and an industry body together on one call to talk about how to collaborate better? I think that's pretty unique. So I want to introduce each of our guests today, and then we'll get started. So maybe you just raise your hand and wave as I introduce you. But we have Isabella Tonaca, who's the Executive Director, of SCTI. And SCTI is a group of leading chemical companies committed to driving transformational change in the textile and leather value chains through sustainable chemical solutions. And a lot of those chemical companies that are part of SCTI have either been involved in or endorsed or in some way supported this paper. So we're really pleased to have Isabella here today. We have Alden, who has already said a quick hello, but is an award-winning journalist and sustainable fashion expert. She's the founder and editor of Eco-Cult and the author of a forthcoming book on chemistry in fashion, due out in 2023. Alberto de Conti, where are you, Alberto? Yes, hello. Alberto, as I mentioned already, he's on the board of directors for Transformers Foundation, but he's also the head of marketing and fashion division for Rudolf Group, which is a chemical company. And he was involved in this paper as an interviewee and as a reviewer. We also have Zaki Saleemi. Yes, hi, Zaki. Who's the Senior Vice President of Crescent Bahuman Limited, which is a mill in Pakistan, a vertical production facility. And as I also mentioned, a founder of Transformers Foundation, and he was involved in this paper as an interviewee. And last but not least, we have Scott Echols of ZDHC, the Senior Director of ZDHC Foundation. And he was also very involved in this report, both as an interviewee and also part of our revision board. So we've got a lot of people here today that have been involved in this paper in various capacities. So without, and the last thing before we get started, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We are very open and welcome and encourage audience questions. Put them in the chat box and we'll come to them towards the end of the session. All right, I think that's all the housekeeping. So Alden, since you're the author of this report, I wanna start with you, and I want to just ask you a really broad question to kick things off, and that is, did anything you found out during the course of your research surprise you?
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises. There were surprises that were just overall about the industry, and then there were surprises in writing the paper. I think one of the things that surprised me the most is sort of the actual lack of strong legislation outside of the EU. I think one of the things that was most shocking to me is that currently, legally, except maybe in California, you can put some really, really dangerous chemicals on clothing and ship them into the United States. And it's perfectly legal to do so, even if you're not legally allowed to purchase or use that chemical in the United States right now. Something like chlordane has shown up on some clothing. That was really, really shocking to me. Like, asbestos is not actually illegal in the United States. Not that that has much to do with jeans or denim or clothing, but so that was really shocking to me. But there's only like 3 substances that are regulated for clothing, and only for children's clothing in the United States as well at the federal level. That doesn't mean there's no regulation at all. What we have instead is sort of a patchwork of a few different states going above and beyond, and then the rest not doing really anything, which has created a really complex legal landscape for brands that want to sell into the United States. And then you multiply that times, the number of countries in the world, and you can see how complicated it is for brands and suppliers to adhere to legal requirements. And then you have, beyond that, you have sort of voluntary commitments as well. So it's a really complicated landscape that we have.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think what you've just shared is about the sort of lack of alignment on the legal front. But Scott, one of the other things that comes out really clearly in this report is there's a lack of alignment legally, but also in terms of brands and retailers. We have so many brands and retailers that all have their own individual approaches to chemical management that they're then requiring of their supply chain. So we have, and that then, suppliers are working for multiple brands. So that then, has a multiplied impact, down the chain. So I'm curious, from your perspective, why is it that so many brands and retailers have their own chemical management standards?
Oh, that's a really good question, and one I've been asked numerous times over the past 20 years. And there's several reasons. I mean, you could ask. I asked myself, why do I have so many connections for electrical outlets across the globe when electrons are the same everywhere? So it's not an uncommon situation where we think there should be some alignment. And I think part of it is everyone's at a different place in their journey. So we have brands that have been at this for 20 years, and we're kind of at the forefront of putting in product requirements that went beyond the legislation. And they started their journey, and picking up on what Alden said, they were maybe all influenced by slightly different requirements or regulations. So they may have all had a slightly different focus, and then they spent 10 or 15 years building up a system internally. And it's hard to change the direction of that ship if it's a really big company and you had invested a lot of money in your systems. It's then hard to cast that aside and say, well, we're just going to go with a group system. So there's, everybody's at a different place in their journey. I think people that are starting now, it's much easier to find groups like a firm or ZDHC that have already put together kind of an overarching requirement. So hopefully that will slow that down. But there's regional drivers, obviously, with the legislation. Different companies have different interests or push different topics based on what they're, what they see there is important to their consumers. So they may have added compounds and things to they may have been a first mover in terms of removing PFAS from their clothing because they saw that their consumers cared about that and they thought it would be a market differentiator. And then there's a certain element of not invented here. It's, everybody for good reasons wants to try to improve on things, but that when that gets out of control and you have everybody just doing something slightly different, but not really making any big difference in impact, then it just is a burden on the suppliers to try to comply with that. So, that was part of the reason why, it was definitely the reason why a firm came together. And it's definitely the reason why ZDHC came together to try to form this overarching umbrella in the absence of any other global driver that was really trying to address this. And it's challenging because we have global brands that are trying to meet the lowest global requirements, but then we have regional brands which are still only focused on their regional requirements. Oh, I think I can't hear you.
Thanks. Sorry. I said I wanted to ask you, you started to allude to this a little bit, but we have all these brands and retailers who have their own sets of rules. And where do like private certification schemes fit within that picture? Could you explain that just a little briefly?
Yeah, they definitely fit into the picture. Again, we have some that have been out for 20 years or more, like Okotex and Blue Sign. They came at it from slightly different perspectives and built slightly different lists based on the concerns that their customers had. And with brands and retailers, some brands have decided to build up their own systems internally and basically take on the responsibility of requesting the testing and coordinating that. And others have delegated that and gone to third parties like Okotex and Blue Sign. And again, it's for a multitude of reasons inside a brand, whether it's easier to outsource something or whether it's easier and you have the capabilities to do that in-house.
Thanks. And I'm going to come in a minute to what the consequences of this lack of alignment on rules are for the denim supply chain, for example, chemical companies or mills. But before I do that, Alden, I want to give you a chance to share your thoughts. I mean, does this system of like, how does this lack of alignment or, a system where everybody is sort of creating their own rules, how does this end up impacting consumers and people working on the production floor? Is it something that is maybe not a streamlined system, but in the end is a good thing for it has some good results or not?
Yeah. So the two that Scott mentioned, Blue Sign and Okotex, are very well respected and that they're the best that we have right now, but they're still private. Like they're still, I mean, Okotex is a nonprofit, they'll tell you that, but there's still voluntary choices that brands can make to go above and beyond, and also to be able to market themselves. And so they're not necessarily tapping enough points to stem the flow of what should be restricted substances or chemical contamination. We all know that most clothing today is created and manufactured in countries that have looser regulations than what you would find in Europe under REACH or in the United States under the EPA or some other countries. And there's a lot of holes for chemicals to come through and reach consumers, especially as we're getting to a point where consumers can go on Instagram and order a top directly from any factory that knows enough to put an ad up on Instagram or Facebook and get it shipped straight to them through JFK, past customs. And there's just nothing stopping a factory from using the cheapest. Not all factories. We have a lot of really good factories here in transformers, but they're being undercut by factories that and suppliers and chemical traders that don't really care about this at all. And there's not a lot stopping them from shipping something straight to a consumer that can have a lot of really dangerous and toxic substances on it. And sometimes it feels like nobody's really in charge because it's all sort of a voluntary thing, except in a few cases.
So in short, you would say, would it be fair to say that all of these overlapping sets of rules put in, voluntary sets of rules put in place by brands and retailers from a consumer perspective are not having the results that we would hope for? Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's definitely fair. And I think also it's we're finding ourselves in yet another situation where people who have the money and the resources and the education and the bandwidth to choose these things are able to choose them. And the people who don't, which is sort of the majority of people in the world, do not. And so it, as a market differentiator, it's sort of like organic food. A lot of moms want to buy organic food, but not all moms can afford it. Or, and I think everybody deserves food that's free of pesticides. And I think everybody deserves clothing that, is safe for them and their family.
Yeah. So I'm Alberto and then Zaki. We've talked a little bit about the consequences of this system on the consumer, but I want to hear from your perspective, from Alberto, from the perspective of chemical companies, and Zaki from the perspective of mills and denim manufacturers. What's the consequence of this system for you? And if there are any examples from your own work, your own context that you'd be willing to share that really bring this to life, I think that would be really valuable. So Alberto, I'll let you go first, and then Zaki.
Okay, thank you, Kim. First of all, I would like to apologize for being in the car, but I'm constantly on the move, and I didn't want to miss out on this. But it's hardly professional, but it is what it is. So from the perspective of the chemical manufacturer, the situation represents complexity, enormous, unnecessary, we think, complexity. And if we really want to drill into some of the specifics, we do have some few hundreds, I think around close to 300 RSL, so they restricted substances list that are coming from the different brands that we need to look after. So there are all open files that we really need to continue monitoring because they're coming from different brands and retailers around the world. And in order to follow up on this and all the different certification systems that we are required to comply to, we have a team in Germany of 5 brilliant scientists that are really fully dedicated to this. From a human resource perspective, that is a little bit of a shame because these are brilliant minds that could be dedicated actually to to research or to more complex tasks. So that's one thing, and then of course there is the financial bit, and it's significant. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of euros every year that basically are invested into maintaining the adequate level of certifications that is required from different markets or different brands around the world. And again, this has been going on now for years and years and years, and you can. I am sure that I represent the entire textile chemistry industry when I say so. I mean, you can certainly talk to just anybody out there, and they would come back with exactly the same scenario. So, basically, it's not really violent criticisms because at the end of the day, whenever we have conversations with brands and retailers out there, there is always or almost always a desire to do the right thing. So brands and retailers are always coming from a really good angle, but individually they don't see the complexity that is caused to the supply chain. So that's why it's probably a good moment to sort of start raising hands and say, listen, this is getting really out of hands. It's really complicated. So let's try and find a solution, a more streamlined sort of way to go about things if we can all together. And as you said at the beginning, it's really all about collaboration and see whether maybe we can have an even sort of closer dialogue than what we have had so far. I'm not saying that there has been a lot of dialogue so far, but I think we need to take it to the next level.
Thank you, Alberto. And Zaki, I want to give you a chance to respond as well from the perspective of denim producers.
Well, like everybody else has pointed out, it's quite a complex, I'm not going to say minefield, because we've been able to identify the areas which are problematic through RSLs, and we have the GCS and MSS testing. So we have all of that figured out. And I think Alden has mapped the entire, textile supply chain through and throughout. However, the reality as a manufacturer is it still leaves the manufacturer open to challenges, because when you have a variety of customers and each customer is trying to get you to toe their line or meet their specific standard, it becomes tricky. You really need to build resource in-house to basically understand what the requirement is, and by engaging in this requirement, does it offset your already accumulated or achieved work? So it does, it does add confusion, and not all companies have the resources or the means or the abilities to even hire somebody for such a position, because it was already understood that, the chemical that you buy from a specific supply chain, brands aside, has to have a certain merit in it, right? It has to be free of certain, let's say, restricted substances. But guess what? When the price basically becomes the barometer for everything, then certain compromises get built into the supply chain. And who basically, who's
Can you give an example?
Who's the good guy there? So I sell a jean for X amount, and all of a sudden, the market tanks, there's a recession. I'm pressurized to sell at 30% under what my price was. So who cuts the corners? Obviously, I can't give that specific jean for the price that I'm being asked for. But if I do produce, what corners am I really cutting? I may have a tier 1 supply chain of chemical suppliers. I may go to a tier 2 supply chain. They may commit to everything being on spec and everything in order, but it's probably not tested to the extent that somebody from a tier 1 category does, right? So a lot of it, I think one of the hidden elements to this is price and the price pressures that manufacturers are open to. Having said that, there are silver linings in all of this. We've been participating in the ZDHC portal for the last, since 2016, and it has definitely helped us kind of find our way through, because every time we get a inventory every month, we automatically upload it. Then we have the ability to see who is qualified, what we're ordering, is it actually qualifying or not qualifying? So having that assurance helps us. But I'm not sure, what percentage of memberships that DHC has at this moment, but at some point in time, certain actions should be mandatory if you want to supply certain product categories. There has to be a baseline. I know it's very difficult for non-governmental organizations and private entities to establish baselines, but when it does concern consumers' welfare, workers' health, and greatly environmental impact, because basically whatever chemicals we're going to use, it's going to end up in the environment, treated or untreated. I don't say everybody treats the way I treat in my facility. So all of that is then subject to a lot of speculation and debate. So we need to rid ourselves of that. There has to be a standard. There has to be a cumulative standard through some collaborative process. Now, I think we've just found ZDHC. I mean, for lack of anything else that's out there, it's, you know, so that's I think a mill's perspective on the way things are. They are fairly complicated.
Scott, I see you nodding, and I wanted to know, do you want a chance to respond to that before we move on to the next question, or, and there's no pressure?
No, I mean, I appreciate that what we've created is useful. I think it's challenging, and I would agree with his points that, you know, he's putting effort into sourcing chemicals and going through, you know, the ZDHC gateway, and you know, that is the challenge is being undercut by places that don't do that. And you know, if we all know that you can get the same kind of look and feel of a garment, you know, many different ways, and that there's nothing the consumer senses usually that would tell them whether they used good chemicals or bad chemicals. And so, you know, the differentiator is not, you know, the quality that they're producing doesn't come through to the consumer necessarily. I mean, the things obviously fall apart faster in the wash or fade maybe differently, but in general, for, you know, the consumer doesn't see that the added value of the work that they're putting in to be protective of them. But I would agree that that's the challenge. And one of the things that I think was the ZDHC differentiates from the previous efforts, where when I was at a brand, we tried to have an MRSL. We just gave the suppliers a list of chemicals and said, here's the chemicals we don't want you to use. And instead of working to under a big umbrella, take in what are all the certifications that are currently out there, or what you would require that's more or less equivalent, that would allow them to choose products that are on the market from a product standpoint, and not just looking for a chemical name in a safety data sheet somewhere.
Alden, I see you nodding, and I want to give you the chance to respond before I turn to Isabella.
Yeah, I mean, I think I from the consumer's perspective, yeah, there's no reason. I mean, I think actually a lot of consumers have no idea what really goes on in the supply chain. Like, a lot of consumers now are very aware of worker rights and labor and, you know, sexual harassment. But I think a lot of consumers right now still believe that that's sort of like over there and it doesn't really affect them, when this can affect them. But there's no way for a consumer right now to pick out something. Yeah, Scott's right. Like, it doesn't come in the ingredient list. If I find out that through a patch test, that I'm allergic to nickel, formaldehyde, and disperse blue dye 34, there's no way for me to know that I'm buying something that's free of that. And so I think that, you know, this shouldn't be a consumer choice. Like, I don't want us to move to a system where some consumers know and pick out better things and some consumers don't. But it's a really, really opaque system. And I don't think factories right now, by and large, are being rewarded for doing the right thing. And in many cases, they're being punished because they're coming back and saying, well, yeah, these certified chemicals, I would like to use them, but they're going to, you know, it's going to be a little bit more expensive. And there are some brands that will pay that. And there are some brands that absolutely will not pay that. And they'll go over to the other factory that can meet their price. And yeah, like you said before, I don't think that should be a choice that brands can make, where they just say, well, you know, do it just make it blue. I don't care how you do it.
Yeah. Isabella, you know, there's a lot that's been said right now, you know, in this session so far about, you know, chemical management systems should be a ticket, you know, a solid chemical management system should be a ticket to play, not a market differentiator. And so I'm curious, from your perspective as a representative of SCTI, which brings together a lot of competitors in the chemical space, what's your perspective on how we get competitors around the same table to align on standards? And is there something that, you know, we're talking about brands and retailers aligning, we're talking about also legislators aligning. is there something that, you know, those spaces could take from the work that's happening now in terms of getting chemical companies at least around the same table?
Well, that sounds very good point to follow up here. Yeah, absolutely. So for those that are not very familiar with STI, as you indicated, we have been formed in 2020 and is an alliance of chemical companies, competitors, that are focusing, driving, powering of the value chain to use sustainable chemistry, state-of-the-art, and sharing their knowledge along the value chain. So I think that's a very good example where collaboration thrives above competition, because the main North Star for SCTI is to have that change happening on the ground. So I'm new to textile, but I have been working sustainability over the last 10 years in different sustainability dilemmas, if you wish. And for me, it's, you know, also by reading your report, it was very clear that at this point in time, textile and leather industries, they are focusing a lot on compliance and to focus on the minimal, if you say, yeah. And I think to the point of Alden, safety should not be a benefit of the rich. Safety is a benefit that all should benefit from. And so that said, I think that the collaborations we have, the working groups that we have in place, they are fundamental to build that basis and to drive sustainability attributes towards the value chain. So that we really move from compliance to positive impact. Yeah, and then if I look around, yeah, I think a lot of learning has been built, a lot of different platforms, certification schemes, driving change, but yet this transformational process is now at the crossroad. So, and for that, we also need to collaborate along the value chain. So from the chemical companies' point of view, the mills, the different sustainable solutions providers, certification schemes, in order to drive this impact, so that also sustainability attributes becomes a benefit to all, not benefit to few, and a marketing story.
Thank you, Isabella. Scott or anyone else, do you have anything that you'd want to add on, you know, and Scott, the reason I pick you out is because I know ZDHC is also doing a lot of work in terms of bringing competitors around the table, but I'm curious, you know, if anybody else has thoughts on what does it take to get people around the same table and to align on a single set of standards? And, you know, is this something we could really see happen?
Well, I guess since you called on me, I'll go first. And you know, my experience has been over the, you know, a firm was founded, I think, about 20 years ago, with Nike and Levi's coming together, and when I was at a brand, we struggled for a long time at aligning and agreeing on, you know, we talked about the issues, but it took us 10 years to even agree to put all our RSLs on one page, and there was multiple reasons for that. And, you know, in the case of ZDHC, honestly, it was the NGO campaigns that lit a fire in the 6 brands that started it, and really, you know, freed up, you know, both funding and internal resources to put the collaboration together. And based on our previous experience with RSLs, and they were generally not effective at just keeping things out of the product, we recognized we needed to move further into the supply chain. But it was really the tipping point was the Greenpeace detox campaign that, you know, forced the brands to sit around the table, to the extent where people were questioning why we were getting so many emails and exchanging so many emails with our competitors in the early days of ZDHC. And I think it had to be a lot of trust developed initially, because these brands are very, they're very competitive. But once that trust developed among the individuals, I think it took off, and I think continues today. It's building trust with the people that you're normally competing with, that you're putting aside your idea that if I add one more compound to my MRSL, I'm going to be I'm going to be able to market that, and I'm going to be a better, more sustainable company than yours. And it's realizing that the cost of doing that, it gets you, almost no impact, and it just comes at a high cost, both internally and externally.
Yeah, there's a really good quote that I came across recently, which is like, there's no such thing as one sustainable business, right? We have to transform the whole ecosystem. We've talked a bit about what it would take to, the will question. What would it take to get people around the same table? But the other part of this question is, even if we could get people around the same table, and even if we could get people hypothetically to align on standards, the open question, I think, is, do we have the information that we would need to be able to decide what that standard should be? And I'm going to give this question to Alden, and then maybe Alberto, give you a chance to respond as well, because I know it's something that you have expressed opinions on to me in the past. So Alden?
Yeah, so there's a lot of disagreement around a lot of the substances. So if you look at a typical RSL, there's a long list of chemicals, which that was really interesting doing research, is just like finding a chemical and then trying to find that chemical in an RSL, because they go by so many different names. And then there's like a little number next to it, which makes it like, I would assume that number comes from a process of like a bunch of toxicological studies, and they like tested it, and they said, oh, okay, like above this amount, we see effects on human health when it's like on their skin all day, or they're breathing it in, or anything like that. And by and large, that's not really true. We have a lot of research for everyday exposure in manufacturing facilities for some of these things, like formaldehyde's a good example. They've done a lot of epidemiological studies that say like, okay, above this amount, it's been linked to certain cancers, and so we're going to keep it below this amount. That hasn't really been done for clothing. And there's a lot of disagreement about, like take PFAS, for example. For a really long time, people said, well, it doesn't really matter for consumer health. It's an environmental thing, but it doesn't matter for consumer health because it's just on the outside of these jackets, and like, so that's not a big deal. But I think there's definitely been research now about how it can sort of come off the jacket and end up in the dust of our homes. And so we have all this disagreement about exposure and risk and all these different things. And so there's been a lot of research around PFAS recently, which is why we're seeing so much happening in terms of legislation and voluntary commitments. But a lot of these things, we don't have the research, and the money, instead of flowing to research to be able to settle these questions, is flowing to labs who just test and test and test and test, and testing is really expensive, to standards that we're not even really sure are the right standards that we need. So a lot of disagreement, a lot of chaos around, what is considered safe and how we should regulate these and what those levels should be.
Is it just about lack of research, or are these also like, let me ask the question in a different way. Is the lack of, like, what's causing the lack of research? Is it money? Is it that these are tough questions to answer, not straightforward to answer? Or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think, well, it's been interesting because I think there's also been just like a lack of interest from a lot of the scientific community or independent scientific community. So for example, when I first started working on this topic, I sent an email to a researcher at Duke, Heather Stapleton. And somebody told me she'd been doing a lot of work on flame retardants in textiles, and I should talk to her. So I emailed her and she said, oh, I don't know anything about fashion. I can't help you. And I came across that a lot. A lot of the smartest people who know the most they work for the industry. And so they are under NDAs. They're working towards industry goals around this. And then I emailed her back 2 years later, and she said, oh, I'm so glad you emailed me. We've been doing a ton of research because her son had a reaction to a synthetic shirt that he'd put on, and they happened to have the tools to start analyzing that in relation to house dust. And so now they have a lot of research coming out around dispersed dyes and sensitization due to that. But that's been super recent. And there's just like I can count them on one hand, the independent researchers at universities that are looking at these questions. And as we all know, research questions like this can take 4 or 5 years to really do well. And so in the absence of that information, it's sort of, we're in a situation where we say, there is no evidence that this causes harm. Is that because it doesn't cause harm, or is it because there's no evidence and nobody's asked the question?
Alberto, I want to give you the chance to respond, and anyone else who wants to jump in is also most welcome.
I think your question, Kim, was, is it possible to align? Right? So I strongly believe that it is. Now, I'm not saying it's easy or it's going to be easy, but it's technically, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't. And if you compare the RSLs that are still out there, you know, if you put them one next to each other, at the end of the day, most of them are very much overlapping. There are differences, of course, but those are minor. So ZDHC has done a great job so far in trying to align all that. And there is like of course, an RSL list and RSLs that ZDHC brings forward, but it's not the sort of that universally recognized yet, unfortunately. But there's no reason why that shouldn't be or couldn't be. And also, I mean, if you start from the real need, because you know the papers start from the Transformer Foundation, therefore we're talking about denim. Denim is cotton, or you know, mostly cotton, and it's indigo dyed most of the times, and it's more or less washed in similar ways. So the issues and the opportunities are the same for everybody. There's no, from a chemical safety perspective, a different requirement from a diesel, paper, whatever jeans you want to mention. So objectively, and I know it's complicated because if it was easy, we would have done it already, but objectively, there are no reasons why, we couldn't be aligned. And the day that we get to that alignment, finally, then we can really focus on what really matters, because that is what causing frustration within the textile chemical industry. I give you an example. There are companies, including ours, that have invested millions. I mean, I'm saying millions, to make sure that cyclics are, for example, stripped from silicones, right? And therefore now in the market there are different quality of silicones. I mean, objectively very, very different from a safety point of view. But nobody's having that conversation. If you from a marketing perspective, from our perspective, we try and market those silicones. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of attention out there, but those should be really the topics that we should be talking about as when it comes to chemical safety, rather than what kind of certification I'm going to slap on my products. Sorry, I'm being a bit harsh maybe with my words, but there definitely is some frustrations out there, and hopefully with the collaboration of everybody, we can get to some.
Yeah. Isabella.
Yeah, I'd like to add here. So I think the first point is, of course, creating transparency on what is the knowledge available in the value chain. So just to name a couple of facts, I think chemical industry, for instance, has invested quite a bit in the last years in innovation, research and development to generate sustainable chemistry. Matter of fact is probably that the knowledge there has not cascaded throughout the downstream, from also what we see in your reports, the lack of expertise and maybe further down in the value chain, how to manage and how to interpret those terms has been probably one key obstacle. The other thing is to make tools that are easy to use, so that people can, that there is a clear communication guidelines throughout the value chain. So we have been collaborating with Blue Sign, the Sustainable Chemistry Index, where we are looking to sustainability in a more holistic way. And then I have seen in the questions, what would be sustainable chemistry from our perspective. So topics around circularity, carbon emissions, water, energy consumption, source of materials, all those elements that if you look into sustainability goals, sustainability ambitions from different value chain players are extremely important. And the source of this information comes upstream from the chemical producers, the chemical suppliers. So I think there is a lot of information, a lot of ability to transform the industry. I think that communication is not yet flowing as it should. And therefore, collaborations like today to discuss on the topic and have this good exchange, I think that they are key. But most important is also how do we get those conversations into action? So how do we bring different people also to work on projects to drive that transformation? I think that is one area that we all need to work on.
Thank you. Scott, I saw you had your hand up, and then we're going to open the floor for questions.
Okay, yeah, just was going to add on to the discussion about data and collecting information about the impacts of these chemicals. And, the first part of my career I spent as an environmental chemist and did a lot of work around trying to help set sediment criteria and looking at the impacts of chemicals. And it's expensive for one thing, to demonstrate that you're maybe in compliance with California Prop 65 through exposure studies, it could cost you in the thousands of dollars for a single chemical and a single article. So there's an expense part. The other part is there's just a lot of unknown information on the toxicity and even well-studied compounds. I mean, if you think about how many studies have you seen on either coffee or red wine, and is it good for you or is it bad for you? And that's the general state of thing. A lot of these chemicals, there's many studies, but there's different indicators, and there's not an agreement necessarily on what's the safety factor if you have a study that's done on one particular species. But I think that there is the possibility, there's a lot of work being done on computational chemistry and using artificial intelligence and looking at the structure activity of chemicals to compare chemicals that have similar structures and actually calculate these toxicities and do estimates that way. And I think that's one way we could get out of this, because I don't think that, there's just not enough money or time to do all the testing that would be required.
All right, Zaki, last word, and then I'm opening it up to questions.
All right, quickly. So this thing about having a number of different levels of operation, this generally speaking doesn't work. So if I have client X who pays me little amounts of money and I buy a specific chemistry for him, there is going to be cross-contamination at some point in time. I mean, so there has to be a baseline. I mean, you can't have two standards within one facility, and most people work their way around it just to cut corners and manage costs associated, and that in itself is a problem itself. So there has to be intervention at some level, whether it's legislative, whether it's collaborative, it has to intervene. I mean, my personal experience, wrapping it up very quickly, I bought a pair of jeans, I think it was 10, 12 years ago, without naming the brand. And I was traveling, I wore the jeans, I had an itch, I didn't bother. I've been doing textiles for the last 24 years. Put it away, wore it again. A week later, the itch came back. And I just got rid of those jeans. I mean, I didn't even deep dive into it. I'm in textiles. I should have sent it to the lab. I should have gotten tested, but that's just a consumer behavior. So, so we need to address a lot of these things, but there has to be legislation somewhere intervening.
Okay, I'm gonna read some of the questions we've gotten in from the audience, because there's a few, and if people tuning in have more questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. I have a question from Mackenzie Wilson, and she says, "Hi all, loving the conversation so far. On the topic of consumers, how can we effectively communicate the importance of chemical management within the apparel and footwear industry?" So this gets to what you were just describing, Zaki. And as Alden mentioned, there seems to be a sustainability knowledge gap, but doesn't everyone have the right to know what chemicals went into their clothing? Could we see chemicals labeling similar to what Hig is trying to do? Does anybody especially want to take this question?
I can try.
Okay.
I can try to take it. And if anybody else wants to add on, they totally can.
Okay.
So yeah, this is the thing. I think clothing should have labels. And I know it can be a really complicated process, much more complicated for clothing than it would be for food, because, you know, you have multiple supply chain points with chemicals being added and then taken off and then added and finished and all these different things. But I think, you know, I talked to everybody about this during my reporting, and it seems that we could do it. Like if we wanted to, we could do it. We could at least put on a list of like known sensitizers, right? Like we could at least add, say like this contains formaldehyde, nickel, and dispersed dyes. And that would be a great first step. And it is possible. One of the things that's preventing us from doing that is this distrust between all players in the industry. So a chemical company doesn't trust a supplier that they sell to not to reveal their recipe secrets to a cheaper chemical company down the street. And, you know, nobody really trusts each other with all of this information. So when you get a product from a company, it doesn't have a list of CAS numbers, which is sort of like it's like the social security number of all of these different chemicals. It doesn't have that because they don't want to reveal their secrets, which totally makes sense. Like I get it. So, but there are ways to do this. You could pass through that information straight over the supply chain to either a government entity or a company that, you know, signs an NDA and then can communicate this along to whoever needs to know it, whether it's through the, you know, the ingredient label or the whatever is going on. And a little bit of that is happening again for voluntary programs like Cyvera. But yeah, it's possible to do it. And I think that we should do it. We have the technology, we have the structures to do it. It's just a matter of making it happen.
Thank you, Alden. We have quite a few questions, and I want to make sure we get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to put this one to you, Scott, although other people, you are welcome to jump in. The question is, chemical compliance is a legal requirement, isn't it? To understand the value of these certifications, should I understand that both Okotex and Blue Signs allowed limits or substances go beyond the legal requirement? And maybe, Scott, I would add on to that. Like, I know one of the questions you get a lot from brands and retailers is, well, we should just wait to understand what the legal requirements are going to be. And so I'm curious to also hear your thoughts on like, what's this relationship between, on the one hand, as an industry, we need to be moving forward and making progress on this. On the other hand, the law is going to come in at some point, and how do we sort of keep moving even though we don't know what that's going to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, the first point about, is it legally required? That's even a complex question, because there are certain, in both the EU and the US and in other countries, there's like a general product safety requirement. So the US is, you know, there's a general product safety law that says you have to provide a safe product, and it doesn't have any distinction about whether that means, you know, it can't harm you because it breaks or it has a chemical, but you could be sued under that law. Well, then it requires somebody to you know, find out what the problem is. In the EU, there are restrictions against some of the chemicals. So at a very high level, yes, there's legal restrictions against harming a consumer, but at the specific chemical level, the EU has probably the most extensive requirements around chemicals in textile products. And the US, as Alden mentioned, has a very small number of specific requirements, except when you go to somewhere like California, where all things are subject to California Prop 65. The difficulty with that legislation is that it's based on exposure, not a limit. So, for most of the chemicals on that list, there is no limit that you can point to say, if we meet this limit, we're in compliance. You have to do the exposure study, and you have to do it on each different type of article. So it's difficult. And I think going back to predicting what the legislation would be kind of goes back to Alden's point about there's not enough data to necessarily calculate what the safe limit would be. And so in a lot of cases, it defaults to what's the current technology for analysis, and let's put it at the lowest level for the current technology of analysis, and we're going to call that the limit, or just picking an arbitrary limit of like 100 parts per million.
So related to that, there's a question in the chat box from Griffin Christensen, which is, who should be funding and doing this research? Should it be brands doing this? Should it be independent researchers who are largely beholden to what calls for research and funding are out there? How do we make sure that it's available and that there's an incentive to do this research? Alden, maybe I'll let you take this, and then if anyone else wants to add on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's not a lot of funding for this research, especially as it pertains to clothing. I think, a lot of times, as Griffin said, it's sort of, as a researcher, you have to get these grants in order to fund your research. And so you have to convince a panel of people, often men, that this is a worthy topic to look into, whether or not clothing is causing your kids eczema, which I think is why a lot of the researchers that I've talked to are moms. And they care about this, and they think this is a really important topic. But I think I wish that there were a funding mechanism for this, so that we could, so that people could ask the right questions and get answers to those questions. It would still take a while, which is one thing that I'd love to see on alignment as well, is okay, let's just align on what we know right now. And then we can sort of get together and say okay, here are the research questions that we need. Somebody else actually asked to that point, what do I have against dispersed dyes? So I have research against dispersed dyes. It's not actually published yet, but these the Duke researchers, Heather Stapleton, Kristen Overdahl, and there was a third one. They published research showing that. So it took them a really long time to do this, because first they were looking into dispersed dyes because they found them in house dust at really high levels. And then they started looking into them, and then they had to find testing standards. And there were very, very few testing standards for dispersed dyes on the entire, in the entire world, right? And so they had to convince a dye seller to send them dyes, and then they had to spend a year getting those dyes into shape to research them and categorizing them. So they got 12 dispersed dyes, and then finally, years into this process, they were able to test them and show that they are linked to skin sensitization, but just 12 of them out of potentially 5,000 that they found in PubChem. Chemicals that have a structure similar to dispersed dyes. And so there is starting to be evidence that they can be skin sensitizers. There's also research out of France showing that they are linked to skin sensitization. And then France has said, hey, I think we shouldn't have these. But you can see, that took forever, and it took a ton of funding. And it's just a little bit of evidence that we have against dispersed dyes, and there's still so many questions that we need to ask.
Thank you, Alden. Yeah, Zaki, and then I'm getting messages that I gotta wrap it up.
Okay, so I think anybody who benefits from the sale of a particular article or is part of the supply chain has to contribute towards the research. You can divide it up as to the footprint that everybody has, but all
Or the margins people are making?
For the margins or their role in actually creating a product. So everybody's, myself as a manufacturer, the chemical company, the logistics. I mean, everybody has to pay their fair share to actually finance this research. Otherwise, we can leave it to the institutions and the universities, and they'll take ages, right? We all know that.
Yes, all right. So there's still some unanswered questions in the chat box. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but if the panelists have an interest in typing a response to some of those questions, that is most welcome. I just want to thank you all for your time, not only today, but your ongoing involvement in this paper. It's been a labor of love, something that's been in the works for the better part of at least 9 months. And thank you to everybody who joined today to tune in. And I encourage you to please go and read the full report. I think in an hour, we managed to just barely scratch the surface of what's in there. And so with that, I'm going to close this session and thank you again to the panelists and to the participants here today.
You're welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.